Chapter 13. Winnemucca was a western town. Ranches, Indians, cowboys, miners, and the railroad gave it life. The most exciting thing that had ever happened was when Butch Cassidy had robbed the bank 15 years earlier. Whites, Basques, Chinese, and Shoshones lived in relative peace with one another. And like much of the West, it was framed by mountains. Sonoma Peak had a dollop of snow on top even in early summer. Trissy was headed to the train station to pick up the mail in her bright yellow REO automobile with blue accents. She had a strong face that had seen a lot of outdoor life, her eyes an intelligent and friendly blue, framed with curly brown hair. She carried herself with a no-nonsense attitude that gave her an air of dignity, missing from many of her giggling peers. Trissy had already lived much and loved well. The young postmistress of Winnemucca had been recently widowed, and the REO was one of the very few things that W.J. had left her. The car and a copper heart locket engraved with her name. He had been so much fun. A railroad man from Minden who loved life and speed. He had won $150 racing the train and winning in his new REO. He spent the money on two things: custom painting his REO the colors of the Southern Pacific Railroad, and the rest on sweeping Trissy off her feet at 19. She thought it would last forever. The trains carried soldiers home from Europe. It wasn't noticeable at first, but more and more were getting sick. As soon as a soldier was seen to be ill, they put him off the train. Trissy knew something was horribly wrong when W.J. came home one night with a story. 10 soldiers had actually died on his train on the last run. They briefly stopped at Montello, where the crew buried them with simple white crosses, the beautiful Ruby Mountains standing guard. W.J. hoped to get back there and make sure the graves got marked with names, but he never had a chance. The Spanish flu brought from Europe had been an epidemic taking mostly the young and healthy. W.J. Kelsey was dead within days. By now, towns were taking drastic measures to prevent the spread of disease. People were encouraged to wear masks, saloons were closed, and churches could only gather outside or print their sermons in the paper. It was cold comfort to all the families who had lost someone, no drinking or preaching. Even public funerals were barred, and those who didn't die of flu were caught up in a local outbreak of scarlet fever. It was a hard summer and fall. After W.J. died, Trissy helped where she could. Since she had a car, she traveled the countryside visiting ranches and little Indian shacks to check on folks. Disease was causing whole families to be ill at once, so no one could fetch water, cook, or go to town. One little shack was particularly bad. She could smell it from a ways off. A Paiute family were all ill, and the shack nailed up tight. The father had been literally dragging himself to get water. Inside, the mother was nearly dead. Her infant had just died. The 2 little children were also ill, but alive, all of them wrapped in blankets, huddling on the floor. Trissy tried to persuade them to let her open up the shack for fresh air, but the father refused. All she could do was bring them some water, leave some food, and tell the doc when she got back to town. Trissy was one of those rare people born with a heart able to love many. Strangely, she never got sick at all, even though she did a lot of cleaning in sick houses. Fresh graves filled the cemetery like gopher mounds. Trissy was not alone in her widowed state. She overheard a conversation with the cemetery groundskeeper and a young woman dressed in black. Frank made me promise not to remarry before the sod grew over his grave, and I gave him my solemn promise I would not. It's been 2 weeks now. She passed the caretaker money. I wonder if you couldn't have his grave resodded over without delay. Trissy understood. It was so lonely, but she wasn't sure sod would ever grow well in the high, dry Nevada basin. On another day, gathered around a fresh gravesite, were just 6 little girls saying the Lord's Prayer and singing Jesus Loves Me. No preacher, no other mourners. It made Trissy weep and weep until there were no tears left. Trissy wasn't bitter, but it seemed she couldn't get a break. Her mother Teresa had died giving birth to her, so she was given her mother's name. It caused her father pain to hear it, so Teresa became known as Trissy to her family of 5. She spent her early years out at the family ranch near McDermott. She loved watching the Shoshone cowboys. She loved the all-night dances that gathered everyone from 20 miles. As a little girl, she was fascinated with the musicians. She expected some mustache to get caught in a fiddle, and she loved the lemon pies the Basque women would bring. When her father remarried, Trissy was sent to work at the Paradise Valley Hotel at all of 14 years old. It was hard work, but good people. Washing, cleaning, and worst of all, cleaning the dog kennels when the sheepmen came to stay. The work never ended. She was a strong girl and did a good job. Older people appreciated her, but she didn't have many friends, just the work. Sometimes she daydreamed about being like the city girls, wearing dresses, curling her hair, and being noticed by the boys. She had been totally smitten when W.J. had taken notice of her. But life moved on, and she was grateful that she had good work. It always helped her when she felt sad to stay busy with productive things. Driving through town, a squaw threw a fry pan at her husband, drunk on vanilla extract. A sheriff's cowboy was headed to jail with a cowboy in a wheelbarrow, and the train had just pulled in. The cheerful yellow station matched her REO. Trissy visited briefly, then gathered up the sack of mail and heaved it over her shoulder. A 50-pound sack was no problem to her. As usual, the law was detaining the vagrants that had been hiding on the train. They were not allowed to get off in Winnemucca unless they had enough in their pocket for a meal. Some were allowed off. Many stayed on the train, thirsty and starving, hoping to make the next town quickly. Trissy hated to see anyone or anything suffer, but there were so many. One man caught her eye. It was the sense of humor in his face, not mocking, just amused. So many of the men looked hopeless, but this young man acted like he was on top of the world, and he had an honest face. He saw her, too. Tan, confident, and athletic, she was so different than Eastern women. She looked like a woman who could be a partner and a friend, not some useless piece of fluff. In a moment, each sized the other up, and Trissy walked over. "They letting you off?" she asked. "Nope," said Paul. "Wallet's a bit too lean." It was actually the first time he'd been totally bust, but he figured he was almost a Reno, so he'd get by. "Tell you what," said Trissy, "how about you trade some work for some meals for a couple days?" She didn't have any work, but she had plenty of friends who did. Paul would have agreed just because he was hungry, but it was very easy to say yes to her. Trissy bailed him off the train and dropped him off at the Martin Hotel. She paid his room, then headed to her boarding house, where she lived with a white couple and a Chinese man, Loy, and his granddaughter, Bao, an adorable little girl. Bao's mother had died, giving birth prematurely to her when her chunk of Chinatown had been bulldozed. Living at the boarding house was not only cheaper, but far more cheerful than living alone. Paul was in heaven. He sat down to the family-style lunch at a table fitting right in with the ranchers, cowboys, and shepherds, all working men with healthy appetites and a slight aroma. He thought he surely must be in a dream, eating lamb stew with crusty hot bread and sweet butter, followed by dark, almost purple beans and sausage, leek and vegetable soup, strong coffee, and bread pudding. Best of all, it was all he could eat. And eat he did until Paul was full as a tick. And then he slept. Paul shared a dorm-style room with several other fellows, crowded but clean, and Paul slept and slept, dreaming of a brown-haired girl. He got up fully rested and digested, ready to get to work, and he was not disappointed. He was picked up by a ranch hand early and taken to a nearby outfit. Paul had pulled his time as a farm boy, but this was very different. Still, he was game and a hard worker. He spent several days doing odd jobs with the ranch crew at the Circle A, but there was no sign of his angel. The work was hard. The grub was good. One of his favorites was strong coffee with canned milk and sugar that he'd dip his sourdough in. It reminded him of the Soki back home. Paul liked the men of the ranch. They were a whole different breed than the hobo. They were fiercely independent, just like the travelers. But these men were doing useful work. Honorable men who were part of a team, not just out for themselves. No one ever forced them to give anything, but they were some of the most generous folks Paul had ever met. Horses and dogs were as important as men. More than animals, they were friends and partners with names and personalities like Romeo, String Bean, or Sweet Pea. Paul felt a sense of acceptance and belonging. He had a gift of telling stories, taking a good joke with flair, and never putting a guy down doing it. Paul also never turned down a chance to lend a hand. He bucked the hay, shoveled the manure, split the wood, hauled the water. Beyond the ranch crew that Paul worked with were the buckaroos, who were a whole nother class. Like knights of old, they exclusively worked with the cows and rode the horses and kept more to themselves. About half were the distinguished Mexican vaqueros, who seemed to do the simplest task with a sense of showmanship. Sometimes an aspiring youngster would embarrass himself, performing the cowboy hoochie-goochie, wiping his backside on the ground after being thrown from a horse while trying to prove himself. He would usually disappear out on the range for a few days to recover his pride in private, returning a lot less likely to rooster up and brag. A real buckaroo or vaquero just didn't need to brag. They knew they were the best and just did it. Paul's kind of men. On a day when all the buckaroos were out, Paul was sent to round up some mares that had escaped the corral in the night. Paul had a feeling this was more along the lines of jerk the tenderfoot's chain sort of job, but he loved the outdoors, so what the hell. Broad-winged Hawk flashed her white belly as he headed up a small draw. Road had given away to cow trail, and that was pretty piss poor. Soon he had to cut his way through the underbrush with a machete. He had been following tracks and manure piles left by a wild horse stud. It looked like the stallion had eloped with the ladies in question. Suddenly, Paul heard a low snort. Turning slowly, he saw an enormous bull, head lowered and shaking it from side to side, pawing the ground. Paul realized he was in a very bad situation, with a rock wall on one side and impassably thick brush on the other. The only way out was through the bull. Paul pulled out his machete with grim determination. It was clearly him or the bull, and it was not going to be him. He figured he'd have to kill it like the Spanish matadors. Suddenly, the bull's attitude changed. It was as if the beast got Paul's drift and decided that giving up was easier. With a disgusted snort, the bull allowed Paul to drive it back. The ranch crew were dumbfounded when Paul sashayed in, beating an enormous bull in the butt with a switch. It had been a sort of local phantom in the area, but no one had actually seen it. For a day or two, he was something of a hero, but naturally, that didn't excuse him from cleaning the stables. It did get him an extra piece of pie at dinner, though. Paul was surprised at the end of a month to be paid fair wages. A lot of places would take it all back in room and board, but he had made a little over that and had gained a few pounds, too. It was enough to get him on to Reno, on the train, instead of blind baggage. He thanked the boss and took his leave. There was always a lot of turnover on the ranch outfits, but if you left on good terms, a man could always get invited back. He left a letter to be posted, letting Dad know he'd be arriving soon. Heading into town, he began to think again about his Angel. He figured he got paid just enough to delay leaving a couple days so he could find Angel Girl. He went back to the Martin to ask around. He was looking a bit more respectable, and the girls working there were definitely giving him some appreciative side glances. The hotel was the heart of the town. Dances were held there, news was distributed, and pregnant women waited for their time there so they could be near a doctor instead of isolated hours away on a ranch. Paul figured they were like human lambing barns. He headed out to the outhouse and pulled out a blue book, happy to have some leisure time. "I cannot believe you did that," drawled a voice, accentuating every syllable slowly. "I will get you for this." Paul heard running headed his way. The door to the outhouse slammed, and the noxious smell of diarrhea filled the air. Paul decided not to dawdle. Flies were beginning to tickle his behind anyway. Outside, a young cowboy was laughing so hard he had to hold his ribs, nearly crying. "Hey now, it's not my fault you ordered a root beer special instead of root beer." Loud grunting was followed by an accusation. "You knew it had castor oil in it and didn't say anything." "Well, hell," laughed his friends. "You might have been bound up and needed a little help." "Not 5 sodas worth," groaned the other. "That's all right. You'll be all cleaned out before the dance tonight. 'Spect you'll need a bath, though." More cursing, grunting, and blue flatulence filled the air. A dance sounded good to Paul. He headed to the back where there was a classic Western bar with heavy wood and pictures of prize-winning sheep. Paul was always up for an adventure, so he ordered a Bass Punch, a heady mix of orange bitters and brandy. At first, the owner pretended not to understand what Paul wanted. Nevada had passed a state prohibition on strong alcohol sales, but it was largely ignored by the Basques. The owner sized Paul up and then took his money. There were some other fellows hanging around the watering hole swapping stories. One of the cowboys pulled some stones out of his pocket. There was some sparkle to them, and clearly they were good for a jug of brown cheer. Paul had to ask. The cowboy didn't mind. "Sure, we pick these up here and there, north, up around Denio. Opals. Easier than digging for gold. Real pretty, not worth much." Paul looked one over. It was small, but the brilliant fire hidden in the rough gray shell was beautiful. He had never seen anything like it. Paul decided that one punch was more than enough if he was going to find out about the dance and Angel. As it happened, the dance was going to be held at the Martin where the old handball court had been. By evening, the community had gathered. Robust red wine was flowing, the accordion player in full form, and there she was, in a flowing, pale yellow cotton dress that contrasted with her tan skin, a simple copper locket draped around her neck. She was dancing with the very deputy that had tried to keep Paul on the train. Paul wasn't a guy to keep score. He just cut in with a cheerful smile. Trissy was very surprised. She was trying to decide whether to be annoyed, but she just couldn't be. He was handsome and charming and funny. He began to tell her a story, but the young deputy kept cutting in. Trissy felt like a revolving door, but every time she was in Paul's arms, he just picked up with the rest of his story. Nothing seemed to ruffle him. Eventually, the young deputy gave up and turned his attention to the very attractive dark-haired Basque girls. Paul wished he had something to give her, some token to let her know that she was special to him. He wondered what he'd need to do to get one of those pretty opals. Instead, he used what he had, his words. He expressed his deep gratitude, his plans for the future, how pretty she was. It all ran together. And then the whistle sounded. Some of the guests, who enjoyed a splendid meal, including the wine, were flashing badges. Apparently, they were state enforcement officers bent on making an example of the hotel for violating prohibition. The dance broke up. Tootse and Paul stepped outside. They heard crashing coming from the kitchen and the basement. Agents were upending cupboards, confiscating and destroying canned foods, looking for a still. Paul was incensed at the heavy-handedness and wastefulness of the law, especially after they had all just enjoyed the benefits. The husband and wife were taken into custody. The Basque community watched with one stoic face. They knew the futility of direct confrontation. They had survived a long time between two worlds by being tough, patient, and learning to work around the rules. Tootse and Paul stayed to help clean up. Tootse helped organize filling in for the owners because she knew the work never ended, and Paul stayed by her side. By morning, the wash had been done, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. The hotel schedule never missed a beat, even with the owners in prison for a day. It seemed so very ironic to Tootse that the Martins had fled San Francisco after the earthquake and fire, only to find danger and destructions at the hands of their own government. All in all, it just didn't seem right. She loved Nevada because it was very live and let live. It sounded good when people wanted to make life better for all and clean up corruption, especially for the children. But she wondered who decided. Tootse knew her neighbors. Of their own free will, they had loved her and cared for her. They were hard-working families. Why should people far removed from their lives be causing problems in the name of law and order? These forward thinkers sounded high-toned, but if this sort of thing were the result, Tootse thought they could just keep it. Not really conscious thoughts, her ideas just sort of tumbled along as an undercurrent as she worked through the night. Paul's thoughts were much more focused on this amazing woman. It did not seem possible, but after a full day with her, he felt he was falling in love. He didn't care for the name Tootse much, so he christened her Tootse, and she didn't seem to mind. And she enjoyed his company. It was clear that Paul was a kind and intelligent young man. It was good to work side by side with someone again. She wondered if it could work between them. She was a few years older than him, but he didn't seem as juvenile as most young men. Paul stayed longer than was wise in Winnemucca. He played with little Bao, setting off firecrackers together. He and Tootse went on a picnic by the Humboldt River, Paul folding little paper boats just like a big kid. He told her all his hopes and dreams and why he was going to Reno. Tootse came to enjoy being with him more and more, but she didn't want to commit her heart, knowing he would soon head down the road. His little bit of money was running out, but he didn't want to leave Tootse 1 minute earlier than he had to. Finally, the inevitable day came, and they both knew it. She drove him to the train station. Paul cursed that he had nothing to give her. "Look, Tootse, I know I got nothing, and I know you're too good for me, but I can't leave until you know how I feel." His emotion was raw and intense. Tootse felt her heart beating hard. "I'm pretty sure I love you, girl, and all I can give you is a promise. I've got nothing else. I promise you I will write every week, and I promise you I will always tell you the truth. Even if you don't write me, I'll write you until you write me and tell me to stop. That'll give you time to see if I'm a man of my word and if I'll make anything of myself." With effort, he held himself back from touching her. "But girl," he pleaded, his lips practically touching her ear, "I surely do hope you will write me." Tootse could smell him, clean cotton, leather, some borrowed bay rum, and then he was gone. Headed to Reno, on blind baggage, broke again. Tootse touched her face. She could almost feel his breath still on her cheek.